Um, just a little bit about me. I am the head of physiotherapy and sports science for Basketball England. I've been working in basketball since 2012, and the vast majority of that has been with the senior side. And I joined Basketball England back in December 2018, I think. I own a clinic in Bristol if anyone is in the local area and needs any physiotherapy. But today we're going to look at sort of our basics really, and how we can attempt to give our players in this rather strange time the best chance at hitting the ground running once the season starts up again. So we'll be looking a little bit at nutrition, talking around injury prevention and what we can do at this moment in time to help that. Discuss a little bit around the conditioning of our players and whether we can tackle any of the sort of current issues that we might have around conditioning, and then what are we going to do when we return to basketball, and how we can sort of return to basketball in the best manner possible, but also without breaking the players as soon as they get back on court. All of this is linked in with our player development framework. Basketball England's player development framework has.
Andy, sorry, can I just stop you 2 seconds? There's just been a comment in the group that somebody might not be able to hear you. Can everybody just comment in the group if you can hear Andy loud and clear? Thanks, Kramesh. Yeah, crack on, Andy.
Yeah, all good. Yeah, I was just saying that the sort of what we're talking about here does link in quite nicely with our player development framework. And for those of you that have studied it in detail, you'll know that there is a physical robustness pillar. And we are looking to hopefully get some of the messages across, not just to elite players, but also looking at our sort of age group players, with the idea that by the time the age group players come up the ranks, they've got a much better idea of some of the simple concepts that we would like to see in our high level basketball players. By all means, this also means that the sort of wider basketball community can definitely take an awful lot away from what I'm going to talk about, and hopefully it'll help everybody at the current time. So yeah, firstly, starting with nutrition. Hopefully none of this is particularly rocket science really, but it's more a case of just delving into stuff that we as coaches and practitioners can sort of help with, and hopefully we can disseminate some of this information a little bit further down the levels. I like the phrase eating the rainbow. What we're talking about there is our food should be of different colours, and fruits and vegetables come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and different colours often denote different vitamins and minerals that those vegetables have in them. At this time, we probably shouldn't be thinking too much around extra supplementation. All of the sort of multivits that you get in the shops should contain all of the stuff that you would find in normal portions of fruit and vegetables. And considering our relative low level of activity that our players are currently enjoying, all of their supplementation should just be coming from their normal diet. We should also encourage to continue with a high intake of protein. When we're looking at some of our players, especially our age group players, so sort of under 20s and downward, we know that there are a number of factors that will be occurring at this moment in time. We're having a period of nice weather, which is good, but somewhere deep inside of us, there's some evolutionary thing going on where kids generally get growth spurts in the summer, especially when the weather's quite nice. So all of a sudden, our kids aren't doing as much as they normally would do, whether it's in school, both cognitively and physically, and they're certainly not doing as much on the basketball court. So I suspect an awful lot of our kids will be going through this massive period of growth at the moment. Therefore, protein and carbohydrates will be really, really key to help build muscle, bone, etc., etc. at this moment in time. Also on the subject of protein, as we all know, there's a increasing number of vegetarians and vegans nationwide, and that's exactly the same in our basketball community. Now, I've got absolutely no problem with this, but what we have to be mindful of is the amount of protein that is available in non-meat products. It's very interesting when you look at, say, the amount of protein, literally in terms of grams, within a chicken breast, and compare it to the amount of protein or the amount of beans you might have to eat in order to get a similar level of protein. There's quite a lot of beans that you'll have to ingest to get the same amount of protein. Now, protein obviously comes in huge amounts of different sources, but it's just, if you are a non-meat eater, you have to be aware of the amount of protein that you might be required to ingest just to get the equivalent amounts that you would be if you were eating meat. At this moment in time, clearly we always push to stay hydrated, but believe it or not, the immunity that we would get from just keeping hydrated is quite high. So things like not becoming thirsty, not having a dry mouth will actually help us remain quite immune, as some of our saliva or the products within saliva are antibacterial, are antiviral, and therefore making sure we don't have a dry mouth at times will be potentially help us from getting coughs and colds, etc., etc. Looking at vitamins, there is a large bunch of evidence to say that when we have coughs, colds, flu-like symptoms, taking extra vitamin C can help us, but we don't have to necessarily do that in the form of a tablet. Apples, oranges, bananas, pineapple, kiwi fruit will all have a large amount of vitamin C in there. And then on top of that, vitamins such as vitamin D will help boost our immunity. And again, fortunately, we're in a bit of a period of nice weather, so hopefully everyone's topping up their vitamin D stores. On a side note, during the season, we're playing a sport that is predominantly played indoors. Therefore, it's not uncommon to find vitamin D deficient athletes in our cohort. It's just due to the fact that we don't go outside particularly often to play the sport. So if there were to be supplementation or discussions around supplementation in younger athletes, it could well be that the answers come back to vitamin D, actually. I'll touch on portion sizes in a second, but junk food is the bane of most of our cohort. There is some evidence out there to say that the ingesting of junk food, along with a reduction in exercise, switches on certain hormones in the body that make us want to eat more crappy food. This is a relatively new thing. I mean, we've all known that we probably shouldn't eat crappy food, and yet this sort of a little bit of evidence to say that we get hormonal changes as a consequence of eating junk food could be a really interesting one. So thinking about
Andy, sorry we got a question in group. We've got a few people struggling to get in as well, so I'll try and sort that in a minute. So Brian's just mentioned about vitamin D. So what kind of foods are good for that?
Well, there isn't a huge amount of vitamin D in foods. You're more likely to find it within green veggies, so your broccolis, your cabbages, kale, things like that. But actually, our best source of vitamin D literally comes from the sunlight. So I don't know about anywhere else in the country at the moment, but in Bristol we've got nice clear blue skies, and so quite literally getting outside and topping up with the tan isn't too bad. Obviously, making sure you're not getting sunburnt and things like that. And abiding to our government guidelines of what exercise and outdoor space you can use. So, yeah, the best thing with vitamin D is just to get outside, actually.
Yes, yeah, Brian's just put fatty fish like tuna, mackerel, salmon.
Yeah, there's those also on top of that, those are sources of omega-3 and other sort of vitamins and minerals that we generally struggle to get in other foods as well. So what we also should bear in mind a lot with vitamin D, if we're using vitamin D to help boost our bone density, then we'll have to take it alongside of calcium as well. So having a quite a high dairy intake would be wise at the same time. So if we look at portion sizes, again, very, very generic this. Every individual will be different, and it's worth sort of, if athletes are interested in nutrition and diet, especially in the performance side of things, it's well worth discussing with a nutritionist about sort of what foods might suit you as the individual better. And on that note, Basketball England we've just appointed a lead nutritionist, and Sam Barrows will be joining us, and he'll be able to aid people if there are questions on that side of things. But as a general rule of thumb, on a rest day, we probably could reduce a little bit of the carbohydrate intake and boost our vegetable and fruit intake. This isn't a bad shout at this time when we need our immunity to be at its highest. And then on a training day or a game day, then we're probably going to increase the amount of carbs. However, just be mindful that the amount of protein relatively stays the same. And that's due to sort of regenerating and rebuilding some of the cells that we will naturally sort of use and sort of destroy as such as we're playing and training. So we need that protein to stay at a relatively high level. Any comments on that? So when we're looking at injury prevention, we have a brilliant opportunity here. There are very, very few times in a player's career where they will often, where they'll have a relative rest period. This is often enforced through injury, and for the players playing at the top end of the sport, they might well go from a college season into an international season with very, very little rest time, and then after the international season they'll head straight back into college in pre-season. So from my perspective, looking at this period as a bit of a bonus in a young athlete's life, we should probably look at things that might prevent injuries in the future, or at least tackling some of the injuries that they've had in the past. So what I would heavily suggest to you guys as coaches, you will know which of your players have had ankle sprains this season. You'll know which have hamstring problems, groin problems, lower back problems. So it would be well worth tapping into your network of practitioners around you that hopefully also know those players and starting to address some of those old injuries. What I would say to you is that there is, again, a ton of evidence out there to say that once you've had an injury, you are very likely to have another injury to that same area in the near future. Hamstrings are a prime example of this. And whilst whilst most of our players will probably rehab to a certain extent on a hamstring injury, it is likely that they haven't done anywhere near as much as they would do, and at some point in the future they might have further issues with it. So
Andy, can I just stop for a second?
Yeah.
Yeah. Kelson, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi guys. Just a quick question on that. How hard, or is there any kind of guidance you can give in terms of during season, how much a player should be doing in terms of weight-wise, for example, in terms of lifting and things like that? Is there a difference? Or sort of the breakdown of the differences when we're doing in the off season compared to when they're doing during the season?
Yeah, really good point. I'm probably going to tackle that later on when we're looking at our conditioning section. I'll write it down.
Perfect.
Because you're exactly right. There is differences there, and again, worth looking at that.
Okay, thanks, Andy.
No worries. So yeah, I think we can definitely use this time to sort of address some of the current or old injuries that we've got in our players. I would also encourage you to encourage your players to focus on some of the stuff that we generically know the players are kind of poor at. So as we're growing up, when we have growth spurts, our bones grow a lot quicker than our muscles. That's why we see all these gangly teenagers all over the place. It takes a lot longer to build the scaffolding around our bones and our joints than it does to actually grow the bone. Therefore, often we'll find girls and boys with very poor core, very poor flexibility, because the long muscles such as the hamstrings or the quads are struggling to get that extra range of motion that's needed, and therefore stability massively reduces. And we've all seen it when you get a sort of a gangly 13-year-old girl and ask her to stand on one leg, she might well struggle to do that. Well, in a dynamic sport such as ours, we'll often end up with potential injuries on top of that if the stability is really poor. So my encouragement to you would be to just remind players gently that things like core work, stability work, maintaining, if not improving, flexibility is really, really important at this time. And as simply as getting players to stand and throw and catch on one leg could be enough just to challenge their stability function. Their core work will be the numerous ways to do that. And then flexibility wise, they could sit there in front of the TV all day and all night and just do real gentle stretches. Shouldn't be too hard. It should be a light stretch, but held over a long period of time. And the main areas that we'll be focusing on in our sport will be anything around the hips and the lower back, really. Just because when we're playing basketball, and we're in that defensive position, we're in that quarter squat position, and we're a sport that's very quad dominant, i.e. our quads are worked an awful lot more than other areas of the body. So the hips end up getting closed down and having a lack of flexibility there. Because it's a quad dominant sport, you'll then end up potentially not having the strongest of hamstrings in there, and so you'll see a lot of the injury prevention programs will have a lot of hamstring, or what we term posterior chain work, in there. So when we're thinking posterior chain stuff, we're looking at hamstrings, glutes, lower back, things like that. I'll come on to a little bit about basketball related injuries in a second, and hopefully I've touched a little bit on this this period, allowing our bodies to rest up a little bit. The players go through an awful lot throughout the season, whether it's cognitively, learning new skills, tactics, and on top of that, the schoolwork, or whether it's physically. And I think I'm starting to understand more and more that players that play at the top end in their schools, they'll always be the natural athletes. So they'll always be asked to do other things, whether it's play football, do the cross-country run, anything like that. So their physical demands throughout the season are massive. And this is a good time, just occasionally, just allow them to rest. There's no harm in that, really.
Andy, Brian's just said, where were you when he needed you 30 years ago?
Yeah, well, you better ask my mum and dad that, I guess. Cool. So, look, I guess for most of us, these sort of common injuries are not going to be a surprise to you. In the NBA, 26% of the players will have an ankle sprain in the season. It's a massive amount. For most ankle sprains, we could probably get back within 1 or 2 weeks back on the court, but there will be those more serious ones that require potentially even operations to help get them right. Going back to the flexibility and stability stuff, sort of asking the players to do some challenges whereby they're on 1 foot is going to be really, really, really key. The tendon problems, most prominently in our Achilles and our knees, the patella tendon. What I would say to you guys is nearly 2/3 of the senior squads, men and women, have either Achilles or patella tendon problems. And interestingly, when you look at the history behind each of those issues, there are very common traits in there. And most of the time, the patella tendon problems will come about because the player has been thrashed, normally when they head off to college in the US, and they go there with, should we say, poor training techniques, followed by a poor muscular structure, which then overloads the tendon as they do repetitive jumping in movements. The history is extremely similar for the Achilles as well. And what we can do at this moment in time is really tackle things in a twofold manner, I believe, anyway. For those players that have got tendon problems at the moment, they have a chance to A, allow the tendon to recover slightly, and then B, do specific loading work where they are building up the muscles that lead to that tendon, hopefully in the long term, giving them a much bigger scaffolding to allow the tendon to do what it needs to do, and therefore reducing the risk of the tendinopathy reoccurring. For those that don't have any tendon problems at the moment, continuing to do designated strength work to the relative muscles that allow that tendon to work properly is going to be really, really key. And we can certainly push, we'll be putting out some information in the next couple of weeks around simple exercises to help those that already have the tendon problem and those that maybe don't have a tendon problem but can do some conditioning work to enable them to reduce the risk of that stuff occurring. I think in the long term, if we as a cohort are able to reduce the amount of tendon problems that we get at senior levels, it will all come from being much better with dealing with tendon problems now when the kids are in their adolescent years than it will be trying to resolve the problems once they become seniors or even professionals. Lower back pain in growing kids is really quite common. If you couple that with a landing and jumping sport, we need to sort of address the stability and the core work and often the flexibility. I'll give you an example. If I'm going to go and pick the ball up off the floor and my hamstrings have little to poor flexibility through there, then I end up overworking my spinal muscles in order to get to that position to pick the ball up. So there will be a lot of knock-on effects from a lack of flexibility or a lack of core stability. And unfortunately, the hinge point tends to be the area that is most affected. Growth-related issues, often we see them in knee and in ankle or Achilles problems as well. Most of us have probably heard of Osgood-Schlatter's, which is where the patellar tendon inserts into the shin bone and that insertion point becomes inflamed. Again, it's linked with flexibility and stability. So ideally, we can use this time, if people have those sort of issues, you can use this time to really gain length and strength in all muscle groups, really. And that should help reduce these sort of things. However, be mindful. It is not particularly uncommon for some of the adolescents of this world to put on 6 to 12 inches of growth in a summer period. So if in August, when hopefully we are all released, and you see for the first time your squad of 14-year-olds now looking like 15-year-olds, and there's one individual that's put on 6 inches, you will have to be very mindful that they won't have the scaffolding around their major joints to potentially support them as best they can. And in that instance, you as a coach will have to hopefully identify that relatively early on and be very mindful of the amount of load that that individual might be able to tolerate. I'll come on to load in a bit, but these are just things to sort of think about. If we've got this extended period without seeing the players, you might well see some of them with quite a big growth spurt happening over the summer. General stability will help all joints, whether it's the lower back and the lower leg stuff, or even coming up into the shoulders. There's a good amount of evidence to say that shoulder problems will often be linked in with poor core stability. So any sort of stability work that you can do will often help all joints in the body. I've rambled on a bit there. Has anyone got any questions on that section as such?
Yeah, there's a question from Brian. Brian, do you want to just unmute yourself and pose that question to Andy?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah.
Just not if you can. No, cool. My question, I mean, I like I like your little video. It's really useful. I'm thinking of practicality of everybody, players and coaches at this stage for that one. But one thing there we struggle with is understanding frequency and reps. And you know, if it's every other day, if it's every day, those sorts of things. That's where I think we're not savvy enough.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Brian. I think in our world we just take it as granted that that happens. But yeah, really good point. So yeah, when we're thinking of the amount of work we can do at the moment, especially the exercise that I'm showing there, I'm just moving it's a kettlebell, but you know, you can use anything really around my body, and there's obviously a fair amount of stability work going on in my lower leg. This is a pretty simple exercise. We've got very little impact stuff coming through there, and therefore you could probably do this every day, if not a couple of times a day. As soon as we start getting impact stuff in there where we are jumping, we're landing, we're loading up the joints and the tendons a little bit more, then we'll have to be a bit more mindful of the amount that we can do. If you add in there specific strength exercises, such as resistance band work, for instance, again, you'll probably be a little bit cautious about doing it too often. So as a very vague rule of thumb, for a lot of my players, I will often say if you're doing specific rehab drills, which end up giving you a little bit of sort of muscle soreness afterwards, so if we take the example of a squat, for instance, where we might have a bit of load on our back as we're doing it, and the following day I get a little bit of quad soreness because I've worked my quads quite hard, then it's very reasonable not to do that every day. So you'd be looking at the higher load work, doing it probably about 3 times a week. Does that answer your question, Brian? The sets and reps of which you're doing, you probably want to take that. It is very arbitrary, and it'd probably be a lot better to get a specific sort of set of exercises and the sets and reps from a practitioner that knows your injury at the moment. But yeah, again, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the kids or the coaches. They'll go do these. Now that's fine motor skills going on there, isn't it? So I understand there's no loading as such. So you do that. You could like you say, you could do that every day, but it's then how long should you do it every day? And those are the. I know it's each person is going to be quite unique, but is there some generics or rules of thumb we can use, as in till it hurts or before it hurts or whatever?
Yeah. I think generally I would suggest until you feel the burn, really. You know what I mean? So if I was to carry that on, as I didn't do in that video, but if I was to carry that on probably for about 30 seconds, I'd probably start to feel my lower leg burning a little bit. Those ankle stabilizers. So I think as a general rule of thumb, if you went with 30 seconds for a non-impact exercise such as that, then that's a pretty decent one, decent amount of time for that.
Real cool.
Okay, here we go, Kelson. So let me start off with we play basketball, and the kids play basketball and they love it, and all of our basketball skills are underpinned by our general movement skills. So let's say we go and do a jump shot. You're not going to be you're not going to score too many points with your jump shot if you can't jump. So as a basic premise, get the jump right and your shot's going to get right. I'm no coach, but I think that probably, it makes sense in my head. The majority of our fundamental skills, movement skills, are extremely simple. They are things that we do really, really commonly day in, day out on the court. And in my opinion, they're the basis of all our basketball movements, really. We certainly know that if you've got a very high level of fundamental movement skill, then your risk of injury does hugely reduce. And that's because you'll be able to do squat patterns very well. You'll be able to hinge at the hips very well, therefore not putting your back under too much pressure. And a lot of your stability work will be much better in the long run. It makes complete sense, therefore, to try and work on these fundamental movement patterns, and therefore you'll probably see a much better performer coming out at the other end if you're able to do these fundamental skill patterns, movement patterns in a good way. However, during the season, there's kind of not a huge amount of time to be able to dedicate to these sort of things. So for an awful lot of the younger players, given this time off that they're going to have, I think it'd be well worth revisiting a number of these skill movements. So we at Basketball England, we've made a number of videos with Mark Williams's help, where we're looking at some of the movement patterns that we would expect to see in our basketball players on a day-to-day basis. And we will be giving access to these videos over the next few weeks to the national team coaches and disseminating it out from there. But it's just, we're looking at sort of allowing or enabling our players to be able to do these real simple movement patterns, all of which they'll be able to do within their home environment, so that they can really become more robust in the long term. Ultimately, if you're a player and you're injured and you're out for the season because you've busted your ACL, then that's a year of basketball skill that you'll miss out on. So what I really hope is that we'll see with these fundamental skill patterns, we'll definitely see an improvement in the robustness of our athletes. Hopefully then that leads you to seeing an improvement in their performance on the court as well. Cardiovascular work. I mean, the vast majority of us will go out for runs at the moment with our 1 hour of exercise a day. But what I would definitely suggest to the players is that they can try and make their CV work as basketball related as possible. The sport is multi-directional. It's involving jumps, it's involving accelerations, decelerations, and there is no reason why doing basketball-related movement patterns, even on a park in the middle of London, isn't achievable. And there could be an argument to say that they'll be better off doing these type of patterns where they are working on their acceleration, their deceleration, their change direction, than they would be going out for, say, a 5 or 10K run. Now, there is a lot to be said for building up a base cardiovascular fitness, and potentially a 5K run or a 10K run might well do that, but it might also be putting undue stress and load onto sort of immature joints that maybe don't have quite the stability around them at this moment in time. So doing a multi-directional movement such as a T-shape or even a simple shuttle run where you're running to a cone, change direction and running back again might be a little bit more applicable to a number of these athletes at the moment. There was also no harm in adding in a ball and getting them to do dribble patterns alongside of some of this multi-directional movement stuff. And of course, we play a sport where we're jumping, so adding jumps and things like that in there will just make sure that the body is more used to jumping and moving as they go along. What I would say, I didn't really touch on it with the tendon stuff. Tendons are very used to load, and for most of your players, there will be the players' tendons will be extremely used to jumping and landing. Now that they're not doing so much of that, there can be a little bit of a detrimental effect to the tendon if they're not being loaded in that manner. So part of the conditioning work could well be that they have to do some sort of tendon loading work that might involve jumping, so that the tendons continue to maintain a level of conditioning for the jumping sport. There are no rules of thumb though as to how many jumps you should do, but what I would say is that you want to encourage your players to be very mindful of the technique of their jumping and their landing, so they're jumping and landing in a good manner. Does that make sense to everybody? Hopefully it does. Right, here we go. How do we get these players returning to basketball? Well, I put return to basketball, but effectively it's just a posh title for load management, really. The term loading often conjures, I think, a little bit of fear into some people. I'm not sure it's fully understood across the board, and that's certainly one of my jobs, is to disseminate that information a bit better. I quite like this quote from Blaise Dubois. The body will adapt as long as the applied stress is not greater than the body's capacity to adapt. So for all of our kids, if the stress given to them over the course of a number of weeks and months isn't more than that body's ability to adapt, then they shouldn't get any injuries. However, we know injuries still occur, especially non-traumatic soft tissue injuries, and by that I mean your Achilles tendon problems, your knee tendon problems, things like that. So we know these injuries do occur, therefore there must have been at some point along the timeline, there must have been an overload of that tissue that has caused the injury to occur. I hope that makes some sense. But when we're talking about load, we can talk about it in a number of different ways, but for me, I think it's the overall physical or mental stress placed upon the individual. So don't forget that if we have increased stress in our body, so cognitive stress, for instance, then our cortisol levels, so our stress hormone levels, will increase, and there is loads of evidence to say that higher levels of cortisol in the bodies will then lead to soft tissue injuries. Training is a stimulus on the body that we want to be able to use to affect performance in a positive way, we hope. So whilst we might talk about training as being sort of the strength stuff that you do in the gym, it will obviously also incorporate a lot of the basketball court work as well. Kelson, going back to your question around sort of the strength training out of season, this is a prime opportunity for a lot of our players to tackle those problems that they don't get time to tackle during the season. So for a lot of them, their squat techniques, their fundamental movement techniques is really, really good. If they've got the right equipment at this moment in time, I'd be very happy for them to do a lot of strength training work. But, and here's the big but, they must maintain their flexibility at the same time. So we all know, more the boys that do it, they'll go to the gym, and after 2 or 3 months of training hard, they all come out with the best beach bodies in the world. Well, that's not going to help them on the court whatsoever, and if anything's going to happen, they'll just end up with more back problems, less flexibility in around the hips and the knees, and then they'll end up with more problems going forward. So I think we're in a tricky situation here where we do want the players to train, but if they haven't got good advice and good programs to follow, then it might just be worth them just doing the simple stuff at the moment, just to maintain and work on their injury prevention stuff, rather than sort of going, well, how big can I make my quads over the course of the next 3 months? Does that make some sense? So we monitor load in a number of different ways, but ultimately, if we overload our kids, then they're going to be more prone to injury. As soon as they get injured, that means less court time, more time away from their peers, more time away from you as coaches who are looking to improve their skill set. But we do sort of see, if we monitor load and load is used in the right manner, then we'll see a graded increase in the levels of those individuals' fitness. And we would hope that their fundamental movement patterns and movement skills improve over time as well. We don't talk about load in terms of stopping players from playing. It's more a case of monitoring how much they're playing so that they're not going to end up injured. The reason I brought this up now is because I'm very mindful that we could potentially have April, May, June, July potentially off court. So you as coaches are doing all this brilliant CPD stuff. We're doing a little bit at our end, and it's all going to build up to that first day of pre-season. And we all know, we've all seen it, where coaches may go a little bit too enthusiastically into the first training session, and they'll thrash the players with a load of running work and other bits and pieces. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, the individual load on that player has gone through the roof from where they're used to, and then they'll end up with injuries. I'll give you an example. With the senior women's squad, when I was working with them, through our data gathering, we knew that most of the players would be able to tolerate about 3,500 units of load on average across the squad. So in a previous, not the most recent one, in a previous Eurobasket campaign, we were able to inform the head coach of this, and he said, yep, get it. And then at the end of that first week, we had over 13,000 units of load through one individual. That was at the max. 3 weeks later, we had 2 or 3 groins, a couple of hamstrings, all go on us, and all of a sudden the squad was depleted by about a third. And it all could be traced back to the first week where he basically did suicides all week. And that was using our load management, using GPS units and things like that when we had a bit of money back then. So what I'm trying to sort of ask the questions of you guys really is, when the season and basketball returns, how are you going to manage the load of these players? Because what you don't want to do, I certainly don't want to see either, is that 2 or 3 weeks into pre-season, all of a sudden your injury list is going through the roof because the groin isn't used to all that twisty turny movement, or the calf muscle isn't used to accelerating or decelerating and changing direction, etc. So I think currently our challenges at the moment include our athletes that, relatively for what they're used to, they're in a low load environment. Okay, there's very little basketball stuff, very little court stuff, probably very little running or multi-directional movements, and a general deconditioning is going to be occurring at the moment. Like I said, when we think about it from an injury prevention perspective, it's probably not too bad a thing. The body's going to recover. It's going to be sort of adding layers of protection in the form of muscle around joints. And for a lot of these kids, you'll probably see quite a big growth spurt as well. But there is the potential that we get a little bit of tendon weakness or a little bit of muscle deconditioning, and we're going to have to consider that when we get back into pre-season. You and I both know that we can give all of the advice to our players as much as we can, but ultimately we're not there in front of them to see whether they're doing it or not. So there's going to be an element of trust. If you give your squad a conditioning program to do over the course of the next few weeks, some will do it, some won't do it, and you probably won't know until you see them for the first time on court as to who's doing what or who's done what. Equally though, we don't want to break players as soon as they start back at pre-season just because the kid who has done loads of the conditioning work is in great shape. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to break the ones that are not in great shape. For some of our players, if their diet hasn't been pretty very good, then they might see an increase in body mass. That will probably affect their jump heights and their movement patterns as well. And like I've said before, the growth spurts might be a challenge for some of us. But potentially, in terms of an injury or injury risk, and please don't take offense from this, but you guys as coaches might be the ones that will be able to manage their injury risk better than the players will. So the first couple of sessions, if you want to do a fitness test to see how well they're doing, I would certainly front load that onto the start of a session, and then do a relatively light court session afterwards, so that they're not doing loads and loads of up and down through the whole of that session. I think the question will arise, well, how can you as coaches help? Well, I think having good and clear communication between you guys to your players around either their previous injuries or and injury prevention, some of the fundamental movement pattern stuff, maybe pointing them in the right direction in terms of conditioning programs, things like that might well help. being able to utilize other practitioners. So for some of you guys that maybe work in colleges, then your strength and conditioning coaches, your physiotherapists or therapists that are on site, they should have a good knowledge of the players, and I'd hope that they've already implemented some sort of injury prevention program for your players during this time off. And then you guys sitting down with your assistant coaches and your other staff members and really being able to plan pre-season. I fully appreciate none of us know when pre-season is going to start, but at least when it gets going, then hopefully you'll have a great integration with your pre-season plan, so you're not overloading the players too much too soon. And a little bit of a bugbear from me, the use of physical punishments, I think, is still rife in basketball. It was a lot worse when I first started, certainly. But getting players to run suicides because the drill isn't quite working, I think is a little bit old school. And I think when youngsters are doing as much activity as they will be if they're playing at the top end of the sport, adding an extra 5 or 10 minutes just pounding up and down the court probably isn't brilliant for their tendons and their joints. If I was a player, then I think I really need to recognise that this is a time period where, yes, I'm not playing an awful lot of basketball, but it's a really, really good opportunity for me to work on my physical attributes, whether it's my fundamental skill movement or reducing my risk of injury. I've got to be aware of some of the other bits or some of the pitfalls that might be around at the moment, and that is too much food or too much rubbish food, and sort of I need to be aware that if I'm going to decondition, then I need to gradually rebuild myself into a good physical player. So what I mean by that is it's completely fine to have a few weeks off now, but don't panic a week before pre-season starts and go out and try and do loads and loads and loads of basketball, and the individual sort of overloads themselves in that first couple of weeks. And I think there's a player, they need to attempt to try and get on top of the conditioning as much as they're able to, on top of some of the injury prevention stuff, and so that they can move on to the last point where they are preventing injuries in the long term. If by the end of if this time next year we get to playoffs and we've had less tendon problems, less time with players sat on the bench and not playing, then I think we would have utilised this time period really, really well. Any questions on that? I'm sure there was something, unless people are falling asleep. Is that a negative?
Feel free to unmute yourself if you've got a question. Put it in the chat function. Silence is golden, Andy.
Yeah, that's fine. It must have bored people enough that they've gone. Can I jump in there quickly, Andy? Yeah, just quick. Have you got any documents, sort of, to say on what players can do during off season? I know you've answered it and things like that, but is there any kind of documents in terms of what they can do from an S&C point, differentiating between off season, pre-season, and during season? Do we have any kind of documents around that? Or?
No, as far as I'm aware, I don't. I think if that's something that you'd like, then we can look to put that together, definitely.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I'm going to jump on here, Kelson. Back in the old Active Sports days, we did get Duncan French. Don't know if it's a blast from the past there, Andy. He was he did put an off-season program together for our youth coaches. I will dig that out.
Cool.
And pass it through you first, because obviously there might be stuff in there that's not current practice.
Yeah, cheers for that, Brian. That would be handy.
Yeah, that'd be good. Thank you. We are looking to. Some of you might have seen it. We've set up an area of the website just specifically for sports science and medicine under the talent banner, and we hope to populate that with more and more information over the coming weeks as we start to produce things. So yeah, hopefully we can drop some information into there as well, Kelson.
Good. Well, we are coming up on the hour. If there's no further questions, I want to first of all just thank Andy for putting the presentation together, and obviously for your time, Andy.
No problem, anytime.
And I suppose just as a shout out to everybody, everybody on the call tonight. So as you've known, for the last 3 weeks we've been hosting these training webinars covering a number of different subject matters. If there's any particular area of the sport or talent in particular that you'd like us to dig a little bit deeper on, with the if we kind of park coaching to one side, which is being dealt with through Brian and obviously other forums, but if there is anything that you feel like you want us to go a little bit deeper on, then let us know. We'll utilize this opportunity to delve into those subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. But more than happy to delve into other things if you want to, definitely.
And Andy, Matt Shaw here. I just had a quick question. Sorry, from something you said earlier.
Yeah,
that's okay. Just wondered, in terms of injuries with ankles, is there any research to suggest that higher boots, rather than what a lot of guys are wearing at the moment, the kind of lower sneakers, has any impact?
Yeah, interesting you say that. No, as far as I'm aware, there isn't. And you can also look at other sports that have moved in different directions from that as well. So, for instance, rugby used to wear a lot of higher boots. No one does anymore either. And there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of difference in injury rates. The thing that has increased injury rates for ankles in rugby has been a change to the 3 or 4G pitches. So no, there doesn't seem to be any that I'm aware of in basketball. What I would say is the structure of the uppers, which are the bit where you tie your shoelaces effectively, the structure of that, completely anecdotally, it's only going off what I see, but I think the structure of that has a bigger impact on injuries or potential injuries that we do see. And some of the structures are just really flimsy; they're just moving all over the place. So you might have a nice solid base, but if the top of it isn't anchored to the floor particularly well, then you can just see how that'll potentially create injuries. But I think what's worth noting from an ankle sprain perspective is that there's sort of about 50% of the ankle sprains that we get will be through a contact injury. So whether that's normally from a landing on someone's foot, but the non-contact injuries tend to occur towards the end of a quarter or the end of a game, when people are getting much more fatigued, things like hydration dropping and things like that. So there's I feel for the players, there's an educational element to say, if you're not prepared particularly well for the game, whether it's through nutrition, hydration, rest and recovery, then your rate of injury is definitely going to go up. And similarly for you guys as coaches, for that player that's really flagging on court, who's played a number of minutes in a row, they're your at-risk players really from that perspective.
Got you. Useful. Thanks.
And also, on that note, actually, what we do know is that if you have a pretty decent ankle sprain, grade 2 or above, then your ligament is likely to be, the affected ligament is likely to be lax for anything up to about 18 months after the injury. So the use of things like braces and tape at that point is useful. However, I'm not a fan of the American college style, right? You're playing for us there, and we tape everybody, therefore you are getting taped regardless of whether you have an injury or you don't. I think consistently bracing and consistently taping when you haven't got an issue there will reduce your ability to balance on one leg. It reduces what we term your proprioception, which is your ability to stand and stabilize on one leg. So despite a number of senior players, about half the squad, and the men and the women will take their ankles before every game. You know, that's almost always due to previous injuries. It's not normally because of the need to take their ankles, if you see what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, definitely.
I think as long as sorry, go on.
No, we had to strap ankles compulsory in practice and games in college, and yeah, net result was weaker ankles, and you had to rely on them for the rest of your career.
Yeah. And at our end, as such, if we can implement some point during the warm up, as long as there's some sort of single leg balance work, hopping onto one leg, things like that, then every time you do that, whether it's at a training session or a game, then that's just a little micro dose of little stability stuff in there that a player can utilize just to help increase the stability and strengthen around the ankles.
Got you. Good stuff. Thanks.
Andy, we've just had a question from Nick. I'm going to field this one because obviously I know the work we're doing here. So Nick's just asked about helpful hints and guidance in terms of prehab and rehab for ankles and hamstrings. So just so everyone's aware, this is part of Andy's work program for the next couple of weeks in terms of putting some guidance together, some video footage together. And we are going to be releasing that. This is going to fall into that new sports science and medicine section of the Basketballing website, which will be on under the talent tab. So we're working on that guidance and a lot more, which will be in there. So it should be there soon, Nick.
Yeah, I'm getting my head around iMovie at the moment, guys. So give me another few days.
Fantastic. All right then, guys. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. Like I said again, if you've got any suggestions for future webinars, please let me know. Other than that, again, thank you, Andy, and everybody stay safe.